January 31st, 1945, Clark Air Base, Luzon, Philippines. The humidity was stifling, but it wasn't the tropical heat making Major Frank T. McCoy's hands tremble slightly. He steadied the camera, framing the aircraft before him, an intact, nearly pristine Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber, tail number 76312. This was a gift of intelligence, a complete operational airframe abandoned by its crew during the American advance. But to Major McCoy, commander of the Technical Air Intelligence Unit Southwest Pacific, it felt like a silent, horrifying confession. This cannot be their standard design, he might have thought. No Air Force dedicated to crew survival would build bombers this way. The fuselage, a distinctive cylindrical shape measuring nearly 20 meters from nose to tail, gleamed in the tropical sun, justifying its Allied nickname, the Flying Cigar. The 25-meter wings, the 1,500 horsepower engines all appeared flawless, intact. This was not salvaged wreckage, it was a museum piece waiting to reveal a dark truth. But what captured McCoy's complete attention, what would revolutionize American understanding of Japanese aviation doctrine, was what he discovered when he climbed inside the wings through the inspection panels. The fuel tanks were completely unprotected. No self-sealing rubber compound, no armor plating, no fire suppression systems, no protective coatings of any kind. Just thin aluminum skin, perhaps 2 millimeters thick, separating thousands of liters of high-octane aviation fuel from enemy machine gun fire. Major McCoy had examined dozens of crashed Japanese aircraft across the Pacific, but nothing prepared him for this moment. This bomber, abandoned intact during the American liberation of Clark Field, would expose a design philosophy so alien to Western military thinking that it would take months for analysts to fully comprehend its implications. Add new credibility layer. The math was undeniable. Eliminating protection saved over 500 kilograms per aircraft. This weight saving was a deliberate catastrophic trade-off. Every assumption American pilots held about enemy capabilities, about the price Japanese engineers were willing to pay for performance, about the value imperial forces placed on crew survival, was about to be systematically demolished by the evidence contained within this single pristine aircraft. The journey to this revelation had begun 4 years earlier, on December 8, 1941. That morning, as smoke still rose from Pearl Harbor, the other half of the Pacific War's opening act was already unfolding. 82. G4M Betty bombers and 26 G3M Nell bombers lifted off from bases on Formosa, a long, quiet line against the dawn. Their target was Clark Field itself, the primary American air base in the Philippines. The attack achieved complete tactical surprise. Arriving at 12:35 in the afternoon, the Japanese formation flew at 20,000 feet, effortlessly beyond the reach of American anti-aircraft guns. Then, the hammer blow. 27 bombers from the initial wave dropped 636 bombs across Clark Field's runways and facilities. Moments later, 0 fighters swept in at treetop level, their machine guns destroying every aircraft that had survived the bombing run. Of 17 B-17 Flying Fortresses on the ground, 12 were destroyed outright. Nearly every P-40 Warhawk fighter was reduced to burning wreckage. In 45 minutes, American air power in the Philippines had been effectively eliminated. Lieutenant James Harrington, one of the few surviving American pilots, watched from a bomb shelter as the Japanese formation withdrew to the north. What struck me was how they came in, he later wrote in his combat report. Perfect formation, high altitude, totally beyond our reach. Then the fighters dropped down and tore us apart. We couldn't get a single plane airborne. The Betty bombers themselves had departed untouched, demonstrating exceptional range, striking from bases 460 miles away, a feat no American bomber could match at that stage of the war. The Betty's first year of combat would prove devastatingly effective. Just 2 days after the Clark Field raid, on December 10, 1941, 26 G4M bombers joined with older G3M Nell bombers in attacking Force Z, a British naval task force built around the battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse. The attack began at approximately 12:20 in the afternoon. Japanese bombers approached in coordinated waves, their torpedo runs executed with a precision that stunned British observers. The Betty bombers carried the Type 91 aerial torpedoes. These weren't standard deep-water weapons. They were specially engineered for shallow coastal operations, utilizing unique wooden stabilizer fins on their tails to prevent porpoising when dropped at high speed and low altitude. This technical detail allowed them to strike ships even in coastal waters with devastating accuracy. The torpedo attacks focused on the two capital ships. HMS Prince of Wales, a state-of-the-art battleship, took at least 6 torpedo hits. HMS Repulse, while attempting to evade, absorbed at least 4. The underwater explosions ripped massive holes in the ship's hulls. The cumulative damage proved fatal. Both capital ships capsized and sank within hours of the attack. 841 British sailors died. For the first time in naval history, actively defending capital ships were sunk solely by air power while in the open sea. The G4M Betty bomber had achieved what naval theorists had debated for decades. British naval superiority in Asian waters had been shattered in 90 minutes. Across the Pacific theater through early 1942, the Betty seemed unstoppable. It hit Darwin, Australia, from bases 1,500 miles away. It struck Guadalcanal from Rabaul, a distance exceeding 600 miles. Its operational range gave Japanese forces strategic flexibility that Allied commanders struggled to counter. Allied airfields came under attack from Japanese bases that were themselves beyond Allied striking range. This asymmetry in bomber capability, this tyranny of distance meant that Japanese forces could attack at will while Allied forces struggled to retaliate effectively. This advantage persisted through the first 6 months of the war. The Betty, the symbol of Japanese air power's reach, seemed untouchable, but its advantage was entirely dependent on limited Allied fighter opposition. The clock was ticking on its core design flaw. When Betty formations could strike without interception, when they could approach targets at high altitude beyond anti-aircraft range, the aircraft was devastatingly effective. These conditions characterized operations during the first half of 1942. But by mid-1942, the tactical picture began to change with chilling speed. As American fighter strength increased, as the agile but short-ranged Wildcats gave way to more powerful, higher-performance aircraft like the F-4U Corsairs and F-6F Hellcats, and as pilot training improved and tactical doctrine evolved, Betty crews began reporting disturbing losses. American pilots, realizing the Japanese bombers' extraordinary range was tethered to a lack of protection, began to develop specific, relentless tactics to target them. The shift became undeniable on August 8, 1942. 23 G4M bombers from the 4th Air Group departed Rabaul to attack American positions at Guadalcanal. American fighters intercepted the formation over Savo Island. In the engagement that followed, the skies became a crucible. 18 of the 23 Betty bombers were shot down in a matter of minutes. Approximately 120 aviators died in what would become the single worst G4M loss during the entire campaign. Fighter pilots reported the same observation across every engagement, a horrifying consistency that spoke of a fatal design flaw. The Betty exploded into flames with minimal hits. 2 or 3 rounds anywhere along the fuselage or wings produced catastrophic immediate results. The aircraft earned grim nicknames that spread rapidly through American squadrons: Flying Cigar, One-Shot Lighter, Flying Zippo. All references to the Betty's terrifying tendency to bloom into fire from battle damage. It was a machine designed for speed and distance, but it carried its own coffin of high-octane fuel. By October 1942, when Lieutenant Commander John Thomas Blackburn arrived at Guadalcanal, commanding VF-17 flying F-4U Corsairs, the Betty's reputation had transformed completely. "First time we caught a Betty formation, we couldn't believe how easy they went down," Blackburn later reported. "Hit them anywhere along the fuselage or wings, and they'd explode. We actively hunted them, recognizing them as among the most vulnerable targets in Pacific skies." But the true extent of the Betty's vulnerability, the engineering decisions that made such catastrophic losses inevitable, would not be fully understood until American forces began capturing intact examples for detailed examination. The first significant intelligence breakthrough came in November 1942, when Australian forces overran Japanese airfields at Buna in Papua New Guinea. Initial examinations there confirmed what pilots had reported. The fuel tanks had no protection whatsoever. Aeronautical engineers with the Allied Technical Air Intelligence Unit, Southwest Pacific, conducted the first detailed analysis. The wing access panels revealed fuel cells with no protective measures, thin aluminum construction, no rubber sealant layer, no protective coating, no fire suppression systems. This was not field damage. This was standard Japanese design. American bombers by 1942 universally featured self-sealing fuel tanks, utilizing a layered rubber compound that swelled on contact with fuel when punctured, effectively plugging the holes and preventing the catastrophic fuel loss and fires that doomed the Betty. The technology added substantial weight to aircraft, a weight penalty American military doctrine considered essential and non-negotiable for crew survival. Yet here was Japan's primary land-based bomber, operating across the entire Pacific theater, with fuel tanks that offered zero protection. The captured Betty at Clark Field in January 1945 provided the most complete technical analysis. Major McCoy and his team spent 3 weeks dismantling and documenting every system. Their classified report detailed specifications that explained both the Betty's extraordinary capabilities and its catastrophic vulnerabilities. The G4M Model 1 specifications revealed an aircraft optimized ruthlessly for range and speed, an empty weight of 6,741 kg, remarkably light for a bomber of its size. Fuel capacity of 4,780 liters distributed across 8 unprotected tanks positioned in the wing's center section, where they were most vulnerable to combat damage. The aluminum construction provided no protection. American engineers calculated that the weight saved by eliminating protection systems exceeded 500 kilos per aircraft. New emotional framing, 500 kilograms, the combined weight of approximately 7 fully kitted-out crewmen. This weight savings translated directly into extended range, but the cost in vulnerability was equally calculable. The unprotected tanks created a critical failure point, a single system whose destruction guaranteed loss of the entire aircraft and the crew inside. These numbers told the story of design choices made in September 1937, when the Japanese Navy issued requirements that would define the G4M's entire existence. They demanded a range of 4,722 kilometers unloaded. The requirements reflected Japanese naval strategy. An empire stretched across vast Pacific distances, naval bases separated by thousands of kilometers of ocean. They needed bombers capable of striking enemy positions far beyond the range of carrier aircraft. No bomber in service anywhere in the world in 1937 could strike targets at the distances. But the requirements also reflected assumptions about future warfare that would prove catastrophically wrong. Japanese planners assumed that surprise and initiative would provide protection for long-range bombers. They assumed that enemy fighter opposition would be limited by range and numbers. Crucially, they assumed the war would be decided quickly before enemy industrial capacity could generate overwhelming force. Every assumption would prove false. The man tasked with achieving the impossible was Kiro Honjo, who led the Mitsubishi design team. Honjo had studied bomber design at Junkers in Germany, absorbing European aeronautical engineering principles. He understood immediately that meeting the Navy's requirements would demand compromises that Western air forces would never accept. The mathematics were brutally simple. Massive fuel capacity demanded minimal weight. Fuel was heavy. Protection systems were heavy. Honjo faced a genuine dilemma, a moral and engineering impossibility. The cumulative weight of adequate protection armor plating, self-sealing rubber, fire suppression, would make the plane fail the range requirements. To satisfy the demands of the Navy, to give Japan the strategic reach it needed, he made the decision that would define the G4M throughout its service life. Protection would be sacrificed for performance. The fuel tanks would be unprotected aluminum construction. Every kilogram saved would be invested in fuel capacity, range, and achieving the Navy's extreme specifications. The first G4M prototype flew on October 23, 1939. The aircraft met every performance requirement. Range surpassed projections. The bomber entered production as the Navy Type 1 attack bomber. By December 1941, approximately 180 G4Ms were in service, ready to strike Clark Field. The Betty's combat debut demonstrated the wisdom of Honjo's design priorities only in the specific conditions of early 1942. The moment American fighter strength increased, the moment interception became routine, every design choice that prioritized range over protection became a death sentence for the crews. The Guadalcanal campaign exposed the fundamental existential flaw in the Betty's design philosophy. From August through October 1942, more than 100 G4M bombers were lost with their crews in what became a sustained bloodletting that Japanese air forces could not sustain. The single mission on August 8th alone destroyed 18 of 23 aircraft. The crews flying these missions were elite, highly trained airmen, the irreplaceable backbone of Japanese naval aviation. Losing the aircraft was one thing. Losing the experienced crews was a strategic disaster that compounded the design failure. The pattern repeated with brutal consistency. Betty formations would depart from Rabaul, fly 600 miles to Guadalcanal, engage American fighters, and suffer catastrophic losses. The exchange rate was unsustainable. Japan's most capable land-based bomber had been transformed from a feared weapon into what American pilots chillingly called easy meat. Japanese planners had expected losses, but the scale of Betty losses exceeded every projection. The unprotected fuel tanks that permitted 6,000 kilometers range also guaranteed that any hit to wings or fuselage would likely prove fatal. There was no middle ground, no wounded bombers limping home. Betty bombers either returned untouched or exploded in fire. By mid-1943, Japanese engineers recognized that modifications were essential, a tacit admission that the original design philosophy had failed. Starting with the 663rd aircraft produced, they installed compromise measures, 30mm rubber sheets beneath wing surfaces, intended to slow fuel leakage. These were not true self-sealing tanks. They added minimal weight but reduced top speed and maximum range. Crucially, crew survival rates showed no significant improvement. The fundamental vulnerability remained unchanged. Japanese designers attempted a more comprehensive fix with the G4M Model 3, introduced in October 1944. This variant featured actual self-sealing fuel tanks. The change was profound. Fuel capacity was reduced to 4,490 liters to accommodate the leak-blocking material. This modification reduced maximum range to 3,640 kilometers, a loss of more than 2,000 kilometers compared to the original Model 1. It took the Betty and stripped it of its primary defining advantage, its phenomenal range. Only about 60 to 91 of this variant were completed by war's end. The modification came too late and in too limited numbers to affect the Betty's combat record. The Betty's vulnerability became so notorious that American forces used it to their advantage in the most high-stakes engagement of the war. On April 18, 1943, the Betty bomber became the instrument of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's death. American codebreakers intercepted communications detailing the route of his G4M flight from Rabaul to Bougainville. 18 P-38. Lightnings were assigned to the mission, a 400-mile flight at wave-top height to avoid radar detection, navigating across the open ocean with legendary precision. The intercept had to occur within a narrow window. The P-38s arrived exactly on schedule. They spotted Yamamoto's formation, 2 Betty bombers escorted by 6 Zero fighters. The P-38s engaged. Captain Thomas Lanphier and First Lieutenant Rex Barber targeted the bombers. The lead Betty, carrying Admiral Yamamoto, took hits to the wing area, the exact location of the unprotected fuel tanks. The aircraft exploded in flames and crashed into the jungle below. The operation demonstrated multiple aspects of Allied superiority: American signals intelligence, flawless planning, and extraordinary execution. But it also proved the Betty's fatal weakness. There was no possibility of Yamamoto's bomber surviving once it came under attack. The unprotected fuel tanks ensured that a successful interception would be catastrophic, transforming the bomber from a vehicle of command into a blazing funeral pyre. The Betty's vulnerability reached its most dramatic, tragic demonstration on March 21, 1945. 18 G4M bombers took off, each carrying a horrifying weapon: an MXY-7 Oka rocket bomb, a piloted, rocket-powered missile with a Pointu 200 killer warhead slung beneath its fuselage. The mission required the Betty motherships to fly within 20 kilometers of their targets, American naval forces off Okinawa, before releasing the Oka. This burden, the substantial weight and drag of the external Oka weapon, made the bombers even slower, even more sluggish, even more vulnerable than usual. They were unable to evade or maneuver effectively. American F-6F Hellcat fighters were scrambled to intercept. What followed was not a battle but an execution. The Hellcats reached the Japanese formation well before it approached release range. The Betty bombers, already crippled by their load, proved completely helpless. The unprotected fuel tanks guaranteed that any hit would be fatal. One by one, the bombers exploded and fell into the ocean. Not a single Betty bomber survived to reach release range. 137 bomber crew members and 15 Oka pilots died in the attack. The mission represented the ultimate expression of the Betty's fundamental flaw. An aircraft designed to deliver weapons to distant targets could not survive to deliver those weapons when facing prepared opposition. The extraordinary range meant nothing when the aircraft exploded before reaching weapon release range. The final mission flown by Betty bombers came on August 19, 1945, 4 days after Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. 2 white-painted G4M bombers with green crosses departed Atsugi Airfield, carrying Japanese representatives to discuss surrender terms with Allied forces. The symbolism was profound. The white paint and green crosses indicated peaceful intent, transforming the bombers from weapons of war into vehicles of diplomacy. The call signs, Baton 1 and Baton 2, referenced the Bataan Peninsula, one of the most devastating American defeats in 1942. Now, 3 years later, aircraft bearing those call signs carried Japan's surrender delegation. The white Betty bombers with green crosses became the final image of the aircraft that had opened the Pacific War at Clark Field in December 1941. The circle was complete. The bomber that had symbolized Japanese air power's reach and effectiveness now symbolized Japan's defeat. The Betty story, told through its production statistics, is a tragedy of attrition. Total production reached approximately 2,414 aircraft. But few survived to war's end. The overwhelming majority were destroyed in combat, consumed by the fires that the unprotected fuel tanks made inevitable. Thousands of Japanese aircrew died, their survival made nearly impossible by the aircraft's fundamental vulnerabilities. Former Flight Petty Officer Masao Sato summarized the tragedy simply. The Betty was a magnificent aircraft that asked us to die for its range. The comparison with Allied protection systems highlights the stark difference in design philosophy. The American B-17 Flying Fortress featured armor plating, armored glass, and, critically, self-sealing fuel tanks. American doctrine considered these measures essential because trained crews represented assets more valuable than aircraft, which could be replaced more easily than experienced combat veterans. Japanese doctrine reached a different fatal conclusion. The Betty's design reflected a calculation that range and striking power outweighed crew survival. This philosophy assumed the war would be short. When those assumptions collapsed, the design became a liability. The examination of tail number 76312 at Clark Field in January 1945 revealed the complete story. The unprotected fuel tanks were not an oversight. They were a deliberate decision. Japanese designers had created exactly what their specifications demanded, an aircraft of extraordinary range and speed, optimized for minimal weight. They traded protection for performance because they believed the performance advantages would prove decisive. They were wrong, and thousands of men paid the price for that miscalculation with their lives. The Betty bomber is a testament to the price of capability without protection. It reveals a fundamental difference in how nations waged war. American forces designed aircraft to bring crews home. Japanese forces designed aircraft to reach targets, regardless of the cost to the men inside. In the end, the nation that valued crew survival built an air force that could sustain operations indefinitely. The nation that accepted catastrophic casualties for performance advantages built an air force that systematically destroyed itself.